Let's now talk about the different characteristics that describe and define communities of different species and populations. Just as a refresher, remember that organisms, when clumped into a group in a given area, that is called a population. A population is made up of one species in an area, like the population of Santa Barbara. That refers to the humans in the Santa Barbara city limits. You could, like this picture, the alligators in this pond. When you go to the population level, it's just looking at all the individuals in an area. Then the next step up is community. That's all the different types of species in a given area. An ecosystem is now combining the community with the non-living abiotic environment. And then a biome is even a bigger grouping of ecosystems that are similar in structure and function, wider scale types of groupings of these ecosystem groups throughout the world. So tropical areas, temperate areas, those would be somewhat like a biome. Regarding species diversity, in general, the numbers of types of species, which means diversity, it increases towards the equator and decreases towards the poles. The warmth and the humidity, the warmth, the moisture at the equator create a situation where there's a longer growing season, and there's a lot more divergence in species types that will fill all the niches because there's so much life and growth and fertility in those areas. As you move away from the equator, it gets cooler and drier, and fewer species exist. If you also look at the map of the cultural diversity, human cultural diversity and language diversity throughout the world, it would look pretty similar to this species diversity curve. So the land and the climate really orchestrate a lot that goes on our planet. Regarding diversity of species in a community, we can look at the species richness, which is simply the number of different species that are found within a given area. How many different species? The evenness is the relative abundance of those species, how evenly they're distributed throughout the given area, but also how abundant they are in relation to the other species. If you look at community 1 in this picture, it has 4 different species, and community 2 also has 4 species, but the evenness is much higher in community 1, where you have 25% of each species in the total number of the total number of species there, and below, the numbers of each are much less even. You've got mostly one species A and one B and C, 2 of D. So it has the same diversity. If you just went with species richness, they would be the same, but evenness, not the same. So it's about the relative abundances, and it tells you a little bit more about that community by looking at that characteristic. Ecological succession is a description of a process that influences the characteristic of populations and communities. It describes a process where, as an idealized concept, if you're given an area that is completely new, a new piece of land that's clear, maybe there's been a landslide or a flood or a volcanic eruption or a bulldozer has taken everything out, it's the process of the successive communities of living things that will take over there and how that community changes over time. It was an idea developed in the North American Midwest with the idea that if you left a land piece, like a piece of farmland, fallow over time, or in this case, the picture like a pond that was there or built, if it was left over time, aquatic plants would take over, and as they grew and died, they would create more sediment within the pond that would fill up. Bigger plants would come in, more sedimentation. Eventually, the pond would get smaller and smaller and fill in, and then some grasses and quick living weedy things would come in, and then shrubs, and then trees. And over time, this pond would turn into a forest. So that is the ecological succession. And it is something that occurs. It's a process that happens all over the place. Like I said, from an area that's been recently bulldozed or landslide or mudslide or flood, how plants regrow and recolonize that site follow a process, successive communities, and the types of species that are in that site will change over time, and the populations of the species there will ebb and flow as well. The way individuals in a population are clumped or distributed throughout the land is another way to characterize them. They can be regular, spaced out fairly evenly throughout the landscape in this lower left-hand picture. They can be randomly distributed or clumped. These usually relate to, most of the time, not always, but the availability of soil moisture and nutrients and how those are clumped or distributed throughout the land, and then the plants respond to that. The last thing that we'll mention, an influence on population and community size and shape and character, is the edge effect. Take this extreme example, and the types of species that are along the edge of this little remnant, let's say it's a preserve in this in the greater area, that's usually a more diverse sets of species on the edge, because you've got some shade from the trees that are a little bit in from the edge, and you've got a lot of sun on the outer edge. You have more movement in and out of that, so you tend to have more diverse species using that area or growing there, as opposed to the center, which is a little more stable, but it's also more protected. So if a preserve designer is going to decide how big of an area should we preserve and the shape of it, they have to consider the edge effect. The edge effect, there's a little more diversity there, but for animals and anything that moves about, it's going to be, especially prey, it's going to be a more vulnerable area, and those prey need a central core area in the preserve to hide and forage and reproduce. So you couldn't have this be too small, or it wouldn't work too well. So the amount of the edge of habitat is important. If you expand this beyond, like this example of a disturbed area, think about the ocean. The right along the intertidal zone, the edge between the ocean and land is a very diverse area where you have most of the fish and algae, marine plants, and you also have some land plants and some organisms that go from land into the ocean. So you have a lot of different species right there at the edge. So that's a known thing. It's a highly reproductive, highly fertile, and highly diverse ecological part of the whole ecosystem, that edge. And that's something to consider and know about. In the previous slides, we talked about some of the characteristics of populations, what determine the distribution of organisms and individuals within that population, and also about some of the dynamics like ecological succession. And now I want to talk about population growth. So some general patterns and trends that are found in the ways populations change in their size through time. Okay, kind of just a little bit more about these two. Here's some examples of exponential growth. Like I said, since the Industrial Revolution around 1750, and that's when machines started to be developed that could do the work for humans. Our population has just shot up, and it definitely follows that population, that idealized population growth rate model called exponential growth. I think it's interesting to look at that little dip there around 1400, which was the Black Plague that killed over 75% of the population in Europe. It's definitely striking when we compare that to the COVID pandemic, which was really a big deal. But if you were living in those times, it would have been 3 out of the 4 people you knew would have perished in that time. So that had a big effect that you can see on these big scale population growth models. But exponential growth Here's some examples of the logistic growth curve. You can see it in sheep. The study was done from around 1820, or taking data from 1820 to 1940. And you see it following that logistic growth curve where it's very steep at the beginning and then it levels out around 1850, probably due to some resource scarcity. So it follows that. And the fur seals, same thing, looking at the study done from early 1900s till around 1950. You can see that the red curve for the fur seals is nice and smooth, but the dots are the actual data points, just like the graph on the lower right is not that perfect, nice S curve that's idealized, but it follows that general trend. Okay, besides exponential growth and logistic growth, also populations can just fluctuate randomly due to many different factors. There can be a mean abundance, but the population can change and go up and down and not follow either of those first two types of growth curves. This is an example of phytoplankton in the ocean. A fourth way that population growth can express itself is through cyclical patterns of boom and bust, meaning the population goes up, kind of looks like exponential growth. Then it doesn't level out at the carrying capacity. It crests and then it plummets and the population goes way down again. But then after a certain period of time, usually a regular period or periodicity, it goes back up again, and then it goes back down and back up and down. Usually related to these cycles can be related to predator-prey types of interactions where the predator eats more and more of the prey until the prey, there's not a lot left, and then the prey population is already gone down, and then a little lag, and then the predator population goes down because there's not enough food for it. So there's good examples of this I'll tell you in the next slide, but there's that. There's also seasonal cycles that affect population growth and death. So some other possibilities here in the way populations can grow. The old classic example of these cyclical populations, population growth and effects of predator and prey are the lynx and the snowshoe hare. And you have an overabundance of snowshoe hares. Let's say it starts with a great spring. There's lots of greens, the rabbits, the hares, they reproduce a lot and the population gets big. And then there's a lot of food, and then the lynx starts feeding on them. That's the predator, and there's so much food that the lynx populations get bigger and bigger so they dominate and overcome this large population of hares until the population of hares is low. And so then you have a low, you can imagine the graph of the population of the hares was high, and then it plummets as they all get eaten. And at the same time, it's going down, but the population of the lynx is going up because it's getting more food. So it's this up and down oscillating graph of both populations, but they're just not exactly on top of each other, those two curves. They're delayed by a lag, so you have two peaks going up and down for both populations. The next few slides, I'll discuss the factors that actually influence the population size, how that size is regulated. These are factors that relate often to carrying capacity, not always, but sometimes. And then there are also density independent factors, factors that affect population size and growth that are not related to the density of the population. Go back to the kelp idea. And actually, this has happened along our coast here in the central coast of California, where historically we have huge offshore kelp beds, but random storms, or really storms in really heavy El Nino years, rip a lot of the kelp out, and they completely change the population size of the kelp somewhat randomly. So it's not whether the kelp was really thick or thin. It's not the density of the kelp that changed the population growth. It was a random external factor that was independent of the density. Extreme weather, natural disaster, habitat destruction. Yeah, humans always get in there and do a lot of density independent changing of natural population growths. Hurricane could do it too. But this is the pattern you normally would see: is exponential growth and then suddenly a decline that was unrelated to the density. Some examples of R and K selected species and things kind of in between. You're looking at how many different eggs or propagules or offspring are put out per year for each of those species. So you can see their size difference and their reproductive capacity difference and where they are or where they fall on that R versus K spectrum. Yet another graph of human population on Earth, going back to 10,000-ish years ago. Hey, how do we know how many people there were here 10,000 years ago? Well, we don't know for sure, but we have some estimates, and it was probably working backwards below the last numbers that actually were recorded. Here, we know in 1825 there were about 1 billion people. 1930, 2 billion, 1975, 4, today, a little over 8 billion people. So if you did the math, which I'm not asking you to do, you'd see that red line start to point down a little bit. It wouldn't be so steep. It's slowing down. What's going to happen after that? We don't know. But humans are a K-selected species, so we are affected by our density. And what will limit human population growth ultimately? Disease, pollution, resources, the amount of land, fresh water, food. And then I'd also add in there, just kind of popped to mind because it's in like current news a lot, of war. I mean, warring between each other. That happens as space gets more scarce. I know that from a simple example of people I knew that were from Canada. We used to hang out with them. We were friends with this family from Canada that was visiting here, and actually we were both, my family and theirs were parents on a soccer team. My daughters were in soccer, one daughter in particular, and I would see all the parents of the local people, not all of them, but some of them, just yelling and screaming and being pretty tense. And this Canadian family was so just chill and relaxed and always friendly. And I at one point just said, why are you Canadians just so nice and relaxed? And they said, it's because we don't have very many people in Canada. 90% of the people that live in Canada live within 10 miles of the US border, and the rest is rural. And so there's a lot of it's a very non-dense population. And that leads to less stress and less resource competition. I'm not saying Canada's perfect and the United States is evil. It's a known thing that density increases stress, which increases competition, which can increase all these other things and influence the population size itself ultimately. So think about that next time, someone takes a parking space from you. Channel your inner Canada and just say, okay, no problem, there's more. Think about this. This is just my apocalyptic example. I made it up. This is not a picture of Goleta Beach, but what if it was in 25 years? Ouch, who would want to go to the beach? So there's some density dependent, probably fighting and competition for resources there. Let's hope it doesn't get to that point. So one of the positives of looking at our global population dynamics is we have increased our food production dramatically in the last 50, 60 years. So global cereals production has gone up, and gone up higher and faster than global population. So we're making a lot of food. This is evidence that more people, for some, is the answer. It's not to limit population growth, but if we increase global food production, as it is increasing at this fast rate, can't we feed everyone and reduce and eliminate food poverty? So we would not be, besides the ethical kind of discussion about, it's not right for people to not have access to the food they need, which I think is probably I agree with that. But that aside, it means that our population is not showing signs of density dependence yet. We're not hitting carrying capacity yet. If we can make enough food for everyone, there's plenty of food. It's not going to be a limiting factor that forces our population to stabilize. Some people would argue that the more people they are, the greater the workforce, the more brain power we have, and we'll overcome these resource scarcities through technology and innovation. So we don't need to think about reducing population. We just need to innovate more. So that's one idea. But as we talked about earlier, I think it was even in the last lecture though, that we need to think about food distribution. Even though we've got more and more food being produced, it's not being distributed evenly, and people that really need it are not all of them are getting it. So even though we have enough food, if the distribution system is not set up to be equitable or facilitate getting the food to where it's needed, then it doesn't matter, and we still will exhibit signs of population decline or slowing in the rate due to the density. So do you think controlling the number of people on Earth will help alleviate the issues? Why or why not? Another question, do large families cause poverty because there's too many mouths to feed, or does poverty cause large families? If any of you have ever traveled to what we call developing country, where people live in very rural, simple means, and they tend to have bigger families. I lived in Guatemala for a year back in 1997 to 98, and the families that lived in the rainforest, the Mayan families, did have lots of children. One, they didn't practice really any type of birth control, or didn't know or have access to birth control knowledge or methods. They did have large families. So I think it's probably both is my best guess, and this is just kind of my opinion. You can have your own answer, that poverty does create large families, but large families also can create poverty. Maybe not exactly where those large families are. I know large families in the United States, that can be a problem, but it's also a problem that people in the United States consume so many resources per capita compared to a developing country that can create an inequity of food and resource distribution and use. So we're using so many more resources that could go to someone else. So yeah, there's a lot of things you could say about that. Thomas Malthus wrote this essay on the principle of population, and this was an important thing that for Darwin to get his hands on and understand the concept that was presented about overpopulation, or that populations produce more offspring than survive, so a lot of offspring have to die. Not everything survives, and it kind of gave Darwin the idea of why aren't they surviving? Some do better than others during resource scarcity. So Malthus, you can see in this graph, kind of explaining his idea, showing you the population growth curve, which is exponential. But at the time, and it's fairly true, the food production is not exponential. It's linear growth there. So at some point, food production is going to go below or get very close to population needs. And that means that those resources become very scarce and competition is very high, and you'll end up with war, famine, and disease, which can change the population size to bring it back down to the resource limits. Karl Marx had a different view on population size that was different from Malthus, and that was summarized in this statement: accumulation of wealth at one pole is the same at the same time accumulation of misery, agony, toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. So Malthus said that an increase in income leads to an increase in the fertility rate, whereas Marx would have said one will imply the opposite for the common person. So it depends where all the wealth is being accumulated. Marx was definitely someone that wanted more equity and saw the classes, the different, pretty distinct classes at the time in Europe as part of the problem, is there was kind of hearkening to what we talked about. There's plenty of food and resources, but they're all concentrated among the wealthy. So increasing the income didn't always necessarily mean that everyone had an income increase. It can also, like the gross national or domestic income of a country or a region, it could just indicate that the wealthy got wealthier and the poor stayed poor. So he was looking from a very much more equitable communist kind of look at the whole community of all the people. And so he was kind of against Malthus' idea that that might be a solution to increase wealth overall. Some people believe that just advances in technology and agriculture will solve the world's problems, including pollution and resource needs. And that's something for you to think about. We don't know. Will advancements in agriculture and agricultural technology increase food production? They already have, although they haven't increased distribution of that food. So it's part of the solution, but we don't know how we're going to solve all this. And now we have, we're not really talking about it in this lecture, but the pressing problem of climate change is something that kind of is trumping all of these other problems. Like if we can't get a hold on keeping our climate stable, the food distribution problem may not be seen as big of a deal because, like I said, the climate problem is going to be the most important thing of anything as we go on further. Let's talk about ecological footprint. What is that? Ecological footprint measures how fast we consume resources and generate waste. So what our impact is on the ecosystem that we're talking about, what the human impact is. How many resources do you use, how much energy, how big of a city is needed, how much wood, paper, fiber, food, seafood, all these different things go into how much, you could say, your carbon footprint, but also ecological too. All the resources that are needed to support you as an individual human or anything that we talk about. And then throw in the question, what about ecological justice? How many resources do you use and what's left in the wake of that as far as waste goes, but also what's left for others to use? So it's something we also have to consider as we move forward with our population, which is getting more and more, I'd say, density dependent. Demography is the study of the statistics of human populations, usually referred to for humans, such as the birth rate, death rate, income, incidence of disease, things that help describe and illustrate the changing structure of that human population. Also, demographics is something applied to non-human populations as well. You can study the demographics of a population of dolphins in a given area, something like that. Different factors, some of the same factors are used, like age, gender, etc., but some are different that don't apply to non-human beings. A couple more examples of different countries with these different age structures and looking at the growth rate, rapid growth, zero growth, negative growth. An example of a developing country that had a high growth rate, that pyramidal kind of age structure, meaning a lot of young reproductive people, and whose population was becoming way too big, was Thailand. Starting in the 70s, and this Dr. Mackay of Thailand, also called the Condom King, he popularized and helped normalize the use of contraceptives, including condoms, to the population, which really helped slow down their growth rate and stabilize and, kind of diverted the population to a slower growth rate to miss a catastrophe of overpopulation. So it's kind of a interesting idea. I really hope that's not a real Thai baby. It's looking kind of creepy. Of course, birth control through contraceptive pills or other means are ways to slow a population growth for humans. There's some controversies over those, but they are available and sometimes used as a way by a country to get them more disseminated to help people out. Although I know that the information about empowering and educating women in general, giving them a voice, giving them a place to be more educated and improve their lives. It's the women, if the resources are spent on that, that will slow population growth and slow down the rate of population growth in and of itself, because what it does is I mean, there's probably some great personal things that it does for those women, kind of more as an objective scientific way to look at it is it slows, it delays their reproductive years instead of starting to reproduce when they're quite young and then just continuing throughout their 30s and 40s, starting in their 20s. It delays it. The education delays it, and maybe the knowledge and the personal empowerment delays it, and reproduction can seem and become more of a choice. So less children are born. So it's very simple. It's a very simple concept, but in actually politically and getting it out there to raise up the quality of life and the education of women is something that there are factors and influences against that too that have to be overcome. But it's a known thing. So improving women's rights and lives is one of the things that can help with population control. Of course, helps decrease suffering too, and environmental degradation of overpopulation. And as I've said, I think worldwide, increasing women's rights and empowerment and voice and education, all those things can really help with a population becoming more stable and avert a catastrophe where there's so many people, the density becomes so high that we start to have fast hitting K and perhaps even a crisis too, where there's a lot of deaths. That can happen often. It happens in non-human populations where a population gets kind of like almost like the lynx and the snowshoe hare, but the population gets so dense that suddenly there's not enough food for a large portion of the population, and it's a famine, and lots of the organisms die. And that can happen for humans too. We don't want that to happen. We want to stabilize it and transition out of that before that happens. And it's known to increase the capacity of women is a really important and effective way of doing that. Now this picture is probably about, well, I'm not really sure, but often these types of things are about more of a women's voice, but often related to contraception and or abortion too. So that's a whole nother topic.